You ever notice how the US has this weird habit of trying to fix countries by basically cutting them off from the entire world? Like, oh, you're not running your economy the way we like? Cool, no one can trade with you now. Good luck feeding your people. And then they act shocked when it doesn't work out the way they planned. Well, buckle up, because Venezuela is like the ultimate case study in how to take a country that was already struggling, apply maximum pressure, and somehow create a drone-building, Iran partnering, sanctions-evading Frankenstein's monster that keeps Pentagon planners up at night. And it all started with oil. I mean, of course it did. It's always about oil. We're talking about 300 billion barrels of the stuff buried under Venezuela, more than Saudi Arabia, more than anyone except maybe some deposits we haven't found yet. But here's the kicker, most of it is this super heavy, super gunky Orinoco crude that you can't just pump and ship. It needs special refineries, the kind the US built decades ago specifically for this grade. So in Washington's mind, that oil is basically theirs. They just let Venezuela hold onto it for a while, like a bank you don't trust but keep your money in anyway. The problem is Venezuela had other ideas. They nationalized their oil, started using the money for social programs, made friends with Cuba and China and basically every country Washington hates. So the US pivots from awkward frenemy to full-spectrum economic warfare. Sanctions pile up, assets get seized. They even put a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head, calling him a narco-terrorist. Like, damn, that's not subtle. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting I mean completely counterproductive in the way that only massive empires can manage. Every single attempt to crush Venezuela's economy, to isolate them diplomatically, to make them a pariah state, it all backfired. And I mean spectacularly. Not only did Venezuela not collapse, they got more creative. They built new trade routes, new alliances, and oh yeah, a whole drone program that can now threaten US naval operations in the Caribbean. So if you want to understand why the Monroe Doctrine is basically dead, why sanctions might be the stupidest foreign policy tool ever invented, and how a broke Latin American country became a tech hub for asymmetric warfare, stick around. This is the story of how the US accidentally built its own headache. Let's talk Monroe Doctrine. 1823, President Monroe tells Europe, stay out of our hemisphere. Fast forward 200 years and Trump starts calling it the Monroe Doctrine. Because apparently adding Don makes imperialism cooler, the idea hasn't changed. Latin America is America's backyard. When Trump says the American people will control their destiny in our hemisphere, he means that oil belongs to us. It's not about democracy, it's resource colonialism with a PowerPoint. Marco Rubio straight up said the Western Hemisphere belongs to us. Think about that language. Not aligns with us, but belongs to us like property. When Stephen Miller questions Denmark's right to Greenland while claiming US control over Venezuela, you see the naked contradiction. Sovereignty is only legitimate when it serves US capital. The original Monroe Doctrine was anti-colonial. Now it's been inverted, the US asserting colonial control while claiming to defend sovereignty. And Venezuela is the test case precisely because it's the most oil-rich country in the hemisphere, but this isn't 1898. You can't just send in Marines anymore. So they resort to hybrid warfare, sanctions, sabotage, straight-up theft of national assets. Every tactic contains the seeds of its own failure. The harder they squeeze, the more slips through their fingers. Washington thinks sanctions work like turning off life support, freeze assets, block oil sales, watch the economy collapse. In reality, it's squeezing a balloon. The system just bulges somewhere else. The US blocked Venezuela's oil exports. Immediate effect, 99% drop in sales to America. But the emergent effects? Venezuela shipped to China instead, taking yuan payments or treating oil as collateral for $106 billion in loans since 2000. The oil still flows, money still changes hands, but $0 go through US systems. Sanctions accelerated de-dollarization, then Iran gets involved, shipping auto parts that are actually drone and missile components. The sanctions regime created an entire shadow logistics network that operates under the guise of legitimate commerce. Russia piles on with advisors and diplomatic cover. Now you've got a China-Iran-Russia triangle operating 1,500 miles from Miami, the U.S. still imports Venezuelan oil through third-party shell companies while publicly calling Maduro a narco-terrorist. That's not hypocrisy, that's systemic contradiction. You can't maintain international law while systematically violating it. Every sanction creates multiple reactions. China becomes primary creditor, Iran establishes a military-industrial footprint in the Americas, Russia gains a reliable anti-U.S. partner. The U.S. tried to isolate Venezuela and instead integrated it into a competing system. That's a feedback inversion, control mechanisms generating their opposite. And here's the kicker, sanctions forced Venezuela to develop industrial capacity. Necessity is the mother of invention, and economic warfare creates a lot of necessity. They learned to refine, manufacture, and adapt because they couldn't buy parts. Uneven and combined development in action. While the U.S. blocked F-16 spare parts, Venezuela built a different air force. It starts with Iran's Mohajer 2. Venezuela says nice, but we can upgrade. The result, the Arpia, then the ANSU-100 armed with Iranian-aimed guided bombs, then they get the Mohajer 6, 12-hour endurance, 200 kilometers range, can track ships in the Caribbean from Venezuelan airspace. The U.S. Treasury got so spooked they sanctioned the drone company and its CEO personally. That's how you know it's working, but the real game-changer is the Zamora V1, a loitering munition, basically a flying RPG-7 with an 18-mile range and a $20,000 price tag. It can threaten a $2 billion U.S. destroyer. That's a 100,000 to 1 cost ratio. You don't win that math, and they're not stopping. The ANSU-200 is a stealth drone based on Iran's copy of the captured U.S. RQ-170 Sentinel. It's a technological telephone game where the U.S. loses. All this happens at El Libertador Air Base, right next to grounded American F-16s. The symbolism is perfect. The workshops are repurposed auto factories and electronics plants, dual-use infrastructure you can't bomb without looking like a maniac. The operational impact is real, credible anti-access/area denial capability in the Caribbean. Drones that can swarm ship defenses, target coastal assets, and make any intervention far more costly. The U.S. tried to monopolize military tech forever, but ideas spread, especially when people are desperate enough to share them. Venezuela isn't a chess piece, it's a node in overlapping systems, global energy, South American security, China-U.S. competition. Push on the node, and the whole web vibrates. The U.S. sees a linear problem, apply pressure, get compliance. But complex systems are non-linear. Sanctions create emergent properties nobody anticipated. China becomes primary creditor, creating a long-term strategic relationship. Iran establishes a military-industrial footprint in the Americas. Russia gains a reliable anti-U.S. partner. A shadow banking network emerges that other sanctioned countries can use. That's feedback inversion. Control inputs generate opposite outputs. Then there's path dependence. Once you start sanctioning, the system adapts and creates new structures. Even if the U.S. lifted all sanctions tomorrow, Venezuela wouldn't go back to U.S. dependency. They've built alternatives. The system has fundamentally changed. The security dilemma works in reverse here. U.S. pressure militarizes Venezuela, which justifies more U.S. pressure, which militarizes Venezuela further. It's a spiral of Washington's own making, plus, there's an ecological dimension. The extractive model. U.S. corporations want would poison rivers and displace indigenous communities, creating permanent resistance. Complex systems have memory. They remember past injuries and adapt to prevent them. The U.S. intervention isn't just counterproductive, it actively generates the conditions for its own failure. Each action creates multiple reactions that weave into a new system, more resilient, more decentralized, more hostile to U.S. interests. Let's talk contradictions. Venezuela has three big ones: sovereignty versus empire. Who controls the oil? Venezuela or Washington, socialized oil versus private capital. Who profits from extraction? Workers versus bureaucracy. Who actually runs the state-owned companies? These can only be resolved through internal struggle, Venezuelans figuring out their own praxis. U.S. intervention freezes this process. It forces everyone into a nationalist bloc against external threat. Maduro gets stronger, working-class dissent gets suppressed as helping the empire, and nothing actually changes. But here's the dialectical kicker: intervention creates its own negation. Every drone, every Iran-Venezuela deal, every Chinese loan, these are negations of US power. And each negation contains seeds of a higher synthesis, a multipolar world. The drone program is the perfect negation of the negation. US tech captured by Iran transferred to Venezuela modified now defends against US intervention. The tool of empire becomes a tool of resistance, and the whole sanctions evasion network, shadow banking, dual-use shipping, alternative payments is becoming permanent infrastructure. Other countries are watching and learning. If Venezuela can do this under maximum pressure, maybe we can too. Meanwhile, contradictions within the US are sharpening. Imperialism requires massive resources, but American infrastructure is crumbling and life expectancy is falling. You can't maintain a global empire when your own society is falling apart. The conclusion, imperialism becomes its own gravedigger. The more the US tries to enforce its will, the more it generates resistance, accelerates alternative systems, and depletes its own capacity. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. It died when a Venezuelan engineer could sketch a drone based on Iranian modifications of captured US tech. You can't bomb dialectics. You can't sanction historical processes. Material reality asserts itself, no matter how many press releases call someone a narco-terrorist. And that, my friends, is how you accidentally build your own replacement. The US set out to crush Venezuelan sovereignty. Instead, they created a template for sanctioned countries to build alternative networks and undermine imperial tools. Thanks for sticking with me. We covered a lot, from 19th century doctrine to 21st century drones, from dialectics to dual-use shipping. But that's the thing about complex systems, you can't understand them in isolation. If you found this useful, hit that like button. Comment below, can the Monroe Doctrine ever work again, or is multipolarity inevitable? Next week, how US chip sanctions on China created a semiconductor industry that might beat Silicon Valley. It's the same pattern, stay skeptical. Stay curious. Peace.